Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Shives. When people think of the history of incarceration, they don't often associate that with environmental history. But as Dr. Clarence Jefferson Hall Jr. shows in his fascinating study, A Prison in the Woods, the history of the Adirondack environment and the history of incarceration in New York State are intimately associated with one another.
When we take an environmental perspective and look at incarceration through that lens, I think it allows us to see the sort of bigger place that prisons occupy in their environments, and the wide variety of impacts that they can have, and also the impacts that those environments can have on the prisons as well.
Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm really excited to be joined today by Dr. Clarence Jefferson Hall, Jr. Dr. Hall is Assistant Professor in the Department of History at Queensborough Community College, City University of New York. His research focuses on the fascinating and perhaps counterintuitive intersection of environmental politics and mass incarceration in New York State, and that is the subject of a fascinating new book that he has written, A Prison in the Woods, Environment and Incarceration in New York's North Country. The book was published late in 2020 by the University of Massachusetts Press, and I am absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Hall here to discuss this remarkable work. So welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the book, as you suggest, is an environmental history of incarceration. And that, you acknowledge, and I've already said, is a potentially counterintuitive combination of themes. So talk a bit broadly at first, and then we'll dive into the details moving along, but talk a bit about what it means to take this sort of novel approach and what sort of insights can be achieved as a result of this angle, both on environmental history and on history of incarceration.
Thank you for the question. So I guess I would start by saying that when we think about the word environment, we often think about nature. And when we think about nature, we often think about trees and plants and wildlife and mountains and lots of stuff that human beings didn't create. But we also think about freedom and mobility and a lack of constraint, right? Prisons, on the other hand, represent the total opposite of all of that, right? So I think in a way it is counterintuitive to think about prisons having an environmental history or even prisons being part of an environment. But very simply, right, prisons occupy space. So that's sort of where you can begin, sort of at the base. It's just that every prison occupies an environment, and every prison is an environment that occupies another environment. So you have a built environment that's designed to incarcerate sometimes thousands of people in one specific location that is located within a broader environment, whether that environment is populated, whether it's remote and distant from communities. It's going to have an impact, not in the same way as maybe a steel mill or a hydroelectric dam, but it will have an impact. I would say that if we want to think about how environmental history helps us better understand incarceration, I think it's important to understand that what happens inside a prison doesn't stay in prison, right? To borrow really, bad advertising lingo. So there might be a prison that is surrounded by trees that you really can't see from the road. You might not even know it's there, but it's quite possible that the people incarcerated there go out into your community and work on roads or clean up after a storm or work on a hiking trail or build a campsite. So the environments around prisons are often shaped by people who are inside the prisons. People may not realize that. Their impacts may not always be visible, but they're there. And of course, the environments around prisons can have a similar impact. So if you build a prison next to a wetland, as happened many times in the Adirondacks, you could have serious problems related to sewage and fresh water that could affect the health and well-being of people in the prison. If you build prisons in a flood zone or in an area that's prone to fire or hurricanes, as is common in other parts of the country, those places could be susceptible to natural disasters that could lead to people getting out of the prison, lead to people being killed inside the prison. So when we take an environmental perspective and look at incarceration through that lens, I think it allows us to see the sort of bigger place that prisons occupy in their environments, and the wide variety of impacts that they can have, and also the impacts that those environments can have on the prisons as well.
Well, no, I think you do a really fascinating analysis of a lot of that over time, as we'll see in our conversation today. But before we sort of dive into your really enlightening case studies, I want to ask, because you start the book with this, you personally are from the North Country. You're speaking to us from the North Country at this moment. And you also have intimate personal connections to this, what it's called prison land within the Adirondack community through family. How, if at all, did your own experiences in that region inform your analysis?
Well, my father worked for the State Department of Correctional Services for 25 years. He worked from 1973 to 1998 in what was the state's largest maximum security prison, Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, which is only about 10 miles from where I am right now. So his job kept a roof over our heads. My father was a high school dropout, came from a very poor, disadvantaged, violent home, and ended up working in a very violent workplace. Many of the people I went to high school with as well, their families, their parents, their siblings worked in that same institution. So as I started thinking about dissertation topics when I started graduate school, I knew I was going to work in environmental history, but I really didn't know that this would be my topic. My father always hated his job, and we always had a difficult relationship, and that always troubled me. And so I think there was always part of me growing up that wanted to know more about why he was the way he was, why he hated his job, why he was so sort of emotionally distant and removed. And I felt like this project would both satisfy a personal curiosity about the region where I grew up, but also maybe help me better understand what he went through during his life. And so that's definitely a strong personal element there that I think played a significant role in driving me to pursue this project. But also just the fact that growing up here, I knew there were prisons around here. I knew there were a lot of prisons here, but I didn't know anything about them. We went on lots of car rides. I was in the Boy Scouts, did a lot of camping, did a lot of hiking and skiing growing up. And I knew there were prisons, but I was like, well, where are they? Right? They were very well hidden, I have to say. And so as I started thinking about a dissertation topic, I sort of realized one day, I'm like, oh, well, nobody's ever written about this. And these prisons must have an environmental history because they're inside the Adirondack Park. They must have undergone some kind of environmental regulation. There must have been people who were not happy that they were being built. And so I started off just digging through local periodicals, eventually archival research, and I discovered that there was a story to be told about the prison's environmental history. And to come back to the sort of personal angle of this, like, I can't say that I really better understand what my father went through as a corrections officer now after doing this research. But I think that just through the process of thinking about this topic, maybe not necessarily the documents and materials themselves, but just thinking through what I've learned in this process has helped me better understand why he hated his job and why other people I know who have had the same job also hated that job. And so the book is an environmental history, but it's also, I guess, very personal history as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that is really effective, the way that you write, especially when you deal with your case studies that are more recent, which is the bulk of them. There is a clear curiosity by you as the historian of what the individual actors and the communities are yearning for, and a sensitivity, even sometimes when some of what's being said is not sympathetic, there's a sensitivity to the needs of the community that really comes through. So I think that's very effective, and we can really explore some of that as we move ahead. But before those recent case studies, you have this sort of path-breaking moment. This sort of, it's literally path-breaking as it turns out, but we'll get to that. But the first of the case studies, the background for all of this is what ends up being Clinton. And tell me, before they build that facility, and I guess it's probably grown over the years, it's probably not rotting wooden beams anymore, but give me some of the background of where they were building this this prison, right? What was the Adirondack region like in the early 19th century, and what were New Yorkers in the 1820s and 30s when DeWitt Clinton is saying, hey, let's not squander the Adirondacks, and they're sending the Natural History Survey up in the 30s. What are New Yorkers thinking the Adirondacks could be, and what are they at this moment before the prison arrives?
Okay. So before the Natural History Survey, this area was very lightly populated. I mean, the area along Lake Champlain was where most of the population was centered. And then as you went further west from the lake and into the mountains, there were fewer and fewer settlements and fewer people. The people who were there, mainly people from Vermont and people who had come down from Quebec, and started farming. But the growing season is so short and the soil is so rocky that many of these farmers failed very quickly. And so in the 1820s and 30s, you would have seen scattered sort of farmsteads, many of them abandoned though. Many farmers picked up and moved on very quickly after 1 or 2 years. Those who stayed often had to find work in other industries to supplement their incomes. So there was an iron industry in the area beginning in the 1790s. It was pretty scattered and not well organized, but it was starting to develop along Lake Champlain and also in the foothills of the Adirondacks. There was also a very limited logging industry in the area around that time, and a small number of people who had started coming for what we might call a vacation. Very few, but there were some folks from Boston and from New York who were coming up and staying for extended periods of time to hunt and fish and to get away from the city. So the small population in the Adirondacks, mainly people struggling to survive at the time, in the sort of run up to when Clinton is built. And then the Natural History Survey happens in the mid to late 1830s, when the state decides to basically inventory all its natural resources. And the Adirondacks, sparsely populated region, but a region that many people knew contained a wide variety of valuable natural resources, timber, iron, and lots of space, obviously. And the reports of the Natural History Survey are published, they're delivered to the state lawmakers and the governor. And then there's this realization, well, we better not waste all of this stuff that we have that's up there, right? There aren't a lot of people living there. We have all of this uncut timber, all of this unmined iron, all this land that could potentially be transformed for farming or the construction of new towns and villages. We better do something with it. But how are we going to do that? How are we going to get people to move to a place where there's sometimes is snow on the mountaintops in the summer, where sometimes there's snow in May and June, where there's a short growing season? How are you going to develop a place that few people have succeeded in living in? And how are you going to encourage people to move to that place if it is developed, right? Because most people are still farming. So the state decides, well, we have these 2 prisons already. They're overcrowded. We need another one. So what better place to build a prison than in the Adirondacks, where we can use the labor of incarcerated people to make these transformations possible, so that once the environment is transformed, once there are new roads for people to traverse, once there is actual infrastructure in place that will make moving to the place easier, people will want to go there. People will be inspired to move and settle down. And so the prison is really sort of the linchpin, as far as the state goes, for transforming this backwater into sort of a thriving industrial settlement.
It's a really remarkable story, especially as we'll see momentarily, the way that it plays out, in many ways, it kind of works. Before we get to that, let's back up. This is also a history of incarceration, and New York is being, I suppose we could say, innovative in the early republic when it comes to how we deal with the incarcerated populations, how we incarcerate populations. They're famous, I suppose, for the Auburn system, but talk a bit about what New York is doing at Auburn and how we get from Auburn to Sing Sing to Clinton, and sort of what that looks like in this moment.
Okay. So Auburn, the state prison, was opened in 1817. It was seen as a replacement for the state's first prison in Greenwich Village, which had opened in 1797. And that prison, called Newgate, which closed in 1839, that prison was designed as an institution where incarcerated people would work during the day on contracts, so private contracts from entrepreneurs who needed consumer goods produced cheaply for sale. And when they weren't working, they would be attending religious services, they would be able to go to school, become literate, learn a trade or a skill that they might be able to use when they get out and they're re-entering society. The problem was the prison became very overcrowded very quickly, and the resources available to allow each incarcerated person the chance to take advantage of what the prison was offering quickly disappeared, right? There simply wasn't enough money. There weren't enough resources available to make all of that happen. So the state decided it needed a larger prison, and it needed to build new prisons to solve overcrowding. And that's an important point that comes up throughout my book, is that that's always the solution. Just let's build another one, right? So the state was already planning the Erie Canal at this time in the early 18 teens. And so the state decides to build a new prison in Auburn, this little village in the Finger Lakes. And it decides that the old system of incarceration that had been prominent at Newgate no longer worked, right? That incarcerated people were better off if they spent most of their day at work. They would be better off if they did not speak to each other or look at each other eye to eye. They'd be better off if they spent most of their time inside their cells, alone, with a Bible, praying. And this was sort of the complete opposite of what had prevailed at Newgate. And the state reasoned that they were trying to solve a couple problems. One was they didn't want people engaging in behaviors or activities that would send them to prison. So this harsher regime was designed as a deterrent, right? To stop people from engaging in unlawful activity that might land them there. But it's also designed as a tool to prevent recidivism, right? They want the people in Auburn not to come back, right? They want them to hate the place so much that they never return. And both of those hopes, I guess you could call them, never come true, because the state never addresses the actual reasons people are engaging in unlawful activity, right? I mean, it's just like the debates about the death penalty that we continue to have in the US today, right? The death penalty has never been proven to be a deterrent to people committing various offenses. And the same was true in the early 19th century. New York City, Albany, even Rochester, which was just a small city at that time, there were desperately poor people living in these places who had trouble finding jobs, who had trouble finding housing, who lived, I mean, desperately poor lives that I think would be hard for us to imagine today. The housing and the public health and the sanitation issues that they dealt with. And so many folks in the state Senate inspection reports show this. Many folks are engaging in economic offenses, right? They're mainly economic crimes that people are committing that are sending them to prison. But the way that the state is treating them when they get there, you would think they had committed a massacre, right? Because they're not allowed to speak. They're not allowed to look each other in the eye. They face extremely harsh beatings and violent punishments if they break any of the prison's rules. And so what ends up happening, well, folks are released from Auburn. They go home. Life is the same way it was before they went to Auburn. They reoffend. They go back, right? New York is experiencing immigration during this time. City's population is growing, and also populations statewide. The state's smaller cities are growing. Desperately poor people, no real social services or city-run services to assist people who are poor. Even more people engaging in unlawful activity, even more people being sent to Auburn and being brutalized by this Auburn system, right? Where they're working in these factories, producing consumer goods for private entrepreneurs that'll be sold out in the marketplace, where they're taking their meals in silence and not allowed to look each other in the eye, where they're spending lots of time inside their cells with the doors locked, alone, reading a Bible, where the state's response to unlawful activity doesn't match what drove that unlawful activity in the first place. So there's this huge disconnect that I think it's hard to get inside people's heads, but I think everyone knew that there was that disconnect, but their only solution was, well, let's build more, right? So once Auburn becomes overcrowded, then Sing Sing, right? 8 years later, in 1825, the state decides, well, we have to build another prison. This one's full. So the state builds a prison closer to New York City on the Hudson River, next to a marble mine. So you start to see what my book is focusing on. The state starts to realize, oh, okay, prisons cost a lot of money, right, to build. They cost a lot of money to operate. How can we figure out a way to actually make these places financially solvent? And maybe can we find a way to make them profitable? So they build a prison around a marble mine along the Hudson River, closer to New York City, because most of the state's convicted offenders are from New York City. So transporting them to the prison is going to be faster and cheaper. And the Auburn system gets transferred over to Sing Sing. And so the same problems that drove the creation of Auburn, that drive the creation of Sing Sing, eventually drive the creation of Clinton, that the state is not addressing the root causes of people's unlawful activity. They're criminalizing people for being poor, and in many cases for being immigrants who in many cases were poor right off the boat. So the state's response is always the same. But at Sing Sing, as I said, there's this marble mine where the incarcerated people are sent to go in to this stone quarry and cut stone from the quarry for sale on the market. But they're also, as I said, they're also subject to the same rules of the Auburn system: no talking, no eye contact, lots of time in isolation, no socialization during meals, extremely, difficult and backbreaking work. And many incarcerated people at Sing Sing can't take the pressure of all of that. And many end up dying by suicide in the Hudson River, which is right next to the prison. So that prison is where the phrase going up the river comes from, right? This sort of the violence that comes to sort of typify life at Sing Sing, news of that filters its way all across the state. Sing Sing becomes synonymous with this really violent correctional management style. But again, the state hoped that that violence would prevent people from engaging in unlawful activity, that they might think, well, I better not steal that loaf of bread because they might send me to Sing Sing. Well, if that loaf of bread is all that's separating you and your family from starvation, that's a difficult choice to make. You obviously don't want to go to Sing Sing, but you also don't want to see your family starve. So it's an impossible decision. It's a decision no one should have to make, but many people made that decision and paid for it with their lives. So because the state was very inflexible in terms of its thinking about how to manage prisons and how to address unlawful activity, once Sing Sing becomes overcrowded, what's their solution? Well, we've got to build another one, right? We've got to, and maybe what they learn though is that, okay, we built Sing Sing next to a marble mine. Let's try to repeat that somewhere else, right? Because that could be potentially lucrative. So where can we go? Where can we build the next prison where there's a natural resource that can be extracted from inside the prison that can be transformed and sold to businesses and entrepreneurs? And if we go back to that natural history survey that I mentioned before, the natural history survey had pointed out that there were active iron mines all across the northern part of the Adirondacks, many of them untapped and unowned, and that if only the state could build a prison near one of those mines, the state could solve its incarceration problem and could help develop this sort of backwater region of upstate New York. And so in 1842, the State Assembly's Committee on Prisons recommends building the state's next prison in a place that was at that time home to one human-built structure, right? There was a ramshackle abandoned hunting cabin in the sort of central part of Clinton County. And so that's where the state is going to build its next prison. So think about that. The first one is in New York City, densely populated area. The second one in the Finger Lakes, an area where there was population, where a canal was going to be built. The third one very close to New York City, right along a major artery. The next one, literally in the middle of nowhere, right? Literally in an area that didn't have roads, no railroad connection, no town, right? But the hope is that the state will be able to repeat what it considered the successes of Sing Sing, except this time, instead of marble quarrying, iron mining, right? So whenever the state was building prisons, they always had in the back of their mind, yes, incarceration, that's our primary objective here. We have to solve this overcrowding problem. But how can we make these prisons function as engines of economic development? And that was true in the 19th century, and it was true in the 20th century as well.
Absolutely. And the Adirondack prison that results from this really sets a pattern, as you show, for how they deal with this in the North Country. And so we're going to solve at least two problems at once, that we're going to ease the overcrowding, and we're going to finally make use of these untapped resources in the North Country? Well, the environment has something to say about that, doesn't it? And they have a lot of problems early on. Talk about some of the issues that they faced. I mean, building and getting this place operational.
Well, as I mentioned before, there was no infrastructure. The area where the village of Dannemora is today, that's where Clinton State Prison was built, there was no town. There was an iron mine that had been identified by the state inspectors during the Natural History Survey. So they knew there were resources there. There was a spruce forest, which they needed obviously for construction materials and also for fuel for their iron mining activities. So all of the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure, had to be built from scratch. The forest had to be cleared. The land had to be flattened and graded, and roads had to be built. Think about, like, if I were to leave here right now and drive to Albany, it would take me, I go about 80 miles an hour. It would take me about 2 hours to get down there. I've done it in less. The first prison inspectors to travel from Albany to Dannemora, which again, about 2 hours by car today, took 40 hours for them to get there. So that tells you something about the sort of lack of passable roads for people traveling to the region. So all the stuff we sort of take for granted in more populated areas had to be built from scratch. The state engaged in what I consider one of its biggest conservation projects at this time. It's often unrecognized, but the state, when it decided to build the prison in central Clinton County, reserved 20,000 acres of land around the prison, withdrew that land from public sale, and basically seized control of all the resources that were on that property. So the forest, the iron ore, obviously, and whatever water and soil resources were there, all became state property in one fell swoop. But as you mentioned, there were many problems related to the environment that made construction of this prison very challenging. So if you visit Clinton Prison today, there's a little, one of those little blue and yellow state historical markers right in front of the prison. And it says construction began 1845. I'll send this picture to you. And there's truth in advertising with that sign, right? Because it doesn't say built 1845. Construction began in 1845 because construction went on for about 20 years. As I mentioned before, the winters in this area very long. The local journalists reported on this, that when the prison was being built in the winter of 1845, there were still 3 feet of snow on the ground in April when the prison was being built. Trees had to be cut down and used to build the wall that surrounded the facility. The facility needed water, so a local spring was tapped and pipes were built. And the prison had indoor plumbing before most residents had it. They even had a heating and air conditioning system in the late 1840s to keep the prison warm in the winter and cooler during, the 1 week of summer we have up here. So the seasons themselves could pose significant challenges, could delay construction. The fact that they're using mainly wood for construction, which was common in the US at that time, that was the primary construction material, posed a severe challenge. I related in the book the problems they had with the prison wall, which was made out of wood, and that after just a couple years, it started to rot, and there were holes in it, and people could actually crawl through. And there's a great image, I'll send it to you, of the prison in 1869. And you see the wooden stockade around the prison and these huge wooden support beams holding the wall up, because they hadn't yet built a stone wall, and the wall was constantly falling down. And other structures inside the prison, the roofs and the ladders that brought people up to higher floors of buildings, were constantly rotting and requiring replacement. In the winter, the pipes that brought water into the prison could freeze and pose severe health challenges to people working and living there. And as I said, just the mere fact that there were no good roads connecting the prison to other places could be extremely challenging in terms of bringing food, medicine, and other needed supplies. And so there were significant challenges that, as I said, there could pose health risks and risks to people's lives. But at the same time, choosing to build the prison here, which was designed to keep the place financially solvent, maybe even make a profit for the state, drained the state's coffers because it costs so much to build all this extra infrastructure instead of just building a prison. So I would say those were the main environmental challenges that the prison faced in its first roughly 15 to 20 years. Came directly from the fact that they chose to build a new prison in a wilderness, in what was really an unbroken wilderness.
Yeah, so at this stage, it's starting to look like a remarkable act of hubris that is it's panning out how hubris usually does. You've got the building decaying before it's even complete. You've got, as you relay these fantastic stories of like people aren't really feeling that safe in the towers on windy days because they're rocking all over the place. They get an iron mine, and after putting all this time into it, they finally figure out that it's not operable, and then they contract with some fellow to make nails for him. They get that going, and the place burns down, and then he gets annoyed and sues them, right? I mean, it's like everything's going wrong. And it feels like maybe the Adirondacks are fighting back against New York State's design, but ultimately, they've invested in this infrastructure, and as they may have hoped, it does spur regional economic activity. You say that it was a, quote, boon to entrepreneurs. It led to growing investment infrastructure. And often now you've got a labor force, these incarcerated people. And so does this ultimately, after all these issues, start to work the way that decades earlier they had hoped?
Yeah, it's amazing considering some of what you just mentioned and some of what I described, the many challenges that they faced. I drive around here sometimes and I go to the roads that were built by incarcerated people. There's one called the Plank Road, which is just a few miles away. And it was originally a wooden plank road. And that connected the Plattsburgh area to Dannemora and allowed for local entrepreneurs, local businesses to send people up to the prison to sign contracts, to provide farm produce to the prison, to provide clothing, to provide cut logs, stone from local quarries. A variety of goods that the prison needed came from contracts with local business people. I also relate in the book the growth of local businesses that directly depended on the prison. So one that is my favorite one, I would say, that I found, named itself the Clinton Prison Boot and Shoe Company, right? And this was in Plattsburgh. And they were quite transparent about where their products came from, right? They came from a shoe factory inside the prison, and those shoes and boots were then sold to consumers in the area. So there's definitely, you can definitely see more economic activity, more economic growth in the area as a result of the prison opening. And of course, it's important to remember that that economic growth is augmented by the fact that many of the people doing this work are incarcerated. They're being paid next to nothing for the work that they're doing. And in many cases, they really have no choice but to do it. They're the ones out building these roads. They're the ones out cutting the trees. They're the ones working in the iron mine. They're the ones, as you said, making nails in this nail factory for Jacob Kingsland. They're the ones making shoes and combs and a variety of other goods that will end up in people's homes. So, yes, I mean, the prison creates a massive debt for the state, but in terms of starting to transform the Adirondacks into a more modern looking and feeling place, I think I would say it was a success.
And if I jump back chronologically a moment, the first warden, right, because this isn't just about economics, it's also about incarceration, it's an institution, and it seems as though Ransom Cook was attempting to be not only innovative, but also humane, right? He seems to have been trying to make this something different than what you've described at Sing Sing and Auburn. What did that look like, and what were his sort of humane objectives? And obviously, tell me how it was undermined.
Okay. So Ransom Cook was the first warden of Clinton State Prison. So when the prison opened in June of 1845, he was the first top administrator of the prison. Ransom Cook was also the individual who performed the inspection and determined that this place would be the best location for this new prison. So he had been involved in actually locating and then planning the prison long before it was built. He had no background in corrections or in prison management. He styled himself an inventor. He was from Saratoga County. And he was also, though, even though he didn't have a background in corrections, he was a student of the state prison system. He had studied up on how the system had been operating up to that point, and he realized that the system I described earlier, the Auburn system, wasn't working, right? It was not working to reduce overcrowding. It was not working in terms of reducing recidivism. It was a disaster. And so he wanted to try something different. So he instituted a different management style at Clinton, where there really were no harsh punishments for really any infraction, even for folks who ran away. I mean, I begin the book by talking about this escape that happened the very month the prison opened, which I think tells you something. Like, folks who went there when that prison opened, they might have expected the Auburn system, right? They might have expected, it's going to be the same as these other two places. But when those two folks were captured and brought back to prison, the reaction of the prison administrators was much different than I think they expected. So he brought a more humane approach to correctional management. He believed that the best way to, quote unquote, rehabilitate incarcerated folks was to treat them as human beings. Yes, they spent a lot of time at work, but Ransom Cook also built a library where the incarcerated men could go and read and study during their downtime. There was time for them to be outdoors, to exercise, to breathe fresh air. There was time for them to participate in religious services. There were ministers and priests on the staff at the prison. And as I mentioned, probably the most important factor here is that the punishments were not life-threatening. They were not violent. He did not believe that violence would rehabilitate anyone, and no matter what offense they were convicted of. And so for those first 3 years or so, the prison is sort of being built during that time. It's sort of an active construction site that whole time. But he's bringing a different approach to corrections that had not been known in the state really for more than 30, 40 years at that point. And it seemed to be working out. The incarcerated people and Cook regularly talked with one another, shared meals. There seemed to be sort of a spirit of collaboration among the officers and the incarcerated men. I mean, they were building this prison together from the ground up. So I guess they figured working together would probably be easier than, being adversaries. But that all quickly fell apart after Cook was dismissed as warden after 1848, when the state had an election and political parties changed hands.
So this sort of reformist view was a victim of patronage, essentially. And after that, it's basically the same old horrors of Auburn and Sing Sing, except being sent north, or is it still different?
Well, I'll start just by saying, because I didn't mention this before, that correctional, the managers of prisons were, and even the officers were appointed by state lawmakers, and they had to be of the same political party as the party in power. That's not how it's done today. But prison management was determined by, basically, as you mentioned, partisan patronage. These were plum positions given to folks, often as rewards. And as was true in much of New York bureaucracy in the 19th century, regardless of qualifications. Right? So once the Whig Party took control in Albany, Ransom Cook and his counterparts were out of jobs. And once the Democratic Party was back in control of the state government, the Auburn system moved north. A much harsher, more violent correctional management style was instituted, which had been known at Sing Sing and Auburn. The new prison administrators built what was called a dungeon, which is sort of an underground cell area where, I guess, incorrigible incarcerated people would be sent for punishment. They also installed what was called a chair bath, which was this device used effectively to waterboard people. It was this wooden chair where an individual would be strapped in, and they'd place a hood over their head and then pour water over them to simulate the effects of being drowned. And probably I guess the best way that we know that things changed after 1848 was the number of escapes that happened from Clinton after these new managers arrived and instituted this much more brutal system. And the escapes continued through the late 1840s, through the 1850s and 1860s. But not just escapes, there were also episodes of violence inside the prison, both among incarcerated people, but also incarcerated people going against staff members. So it's unfortunate that it would have been interesting to see what could have happened at Clinton if this regime that was sort of instituted by Ransom Cook had been allowed to flourish, right? If partisanship was not part of correctional management at that time. But unfortunately it was, and things deteriorated very quickly after 1848. But interestingly enough, and this is still true to this day, the main street in Dannemora that passes right past the prison is called Cook Street. And there are actually a couple different streets in other nearby towns that are named for him. So he hasn't been completely forgotten, even though his humane correctional style was abandoned.
That was easily and swiftly forgotten, unfortunately. It really feels sadistic, some of what's described in here. I'm glad you brought up some of these. I mean, it's really torture. I wrote in the margin somewhere, waterboarding exclamation point, because as you're describing this, it was reminding me of some of those horrors. Do I remember correctly that although there were very few in number, there were a few incarcerated Black men who essentially were used as enslaved labor? Is that accurate?
Yes. In 1856, I found evidence of the 3 incarcerated African-American men who it appears were targeted for these, how I describe it as enslavement. They were taken, they had to do their work inside the prison, their industrial labor, whatever work the prison administrators put them to, but they were also taken out of the prison and forced to run errands, personal errands for officers. They went on hunting and fishing trips with officers in the local wilderness and carried their equipment in their bags for them. And, you know, if you read, it's interesting, if you read the press accounts of this, and there aren't that many, there were just a couple, it makes it sound as if all of this was okay, as if these 3 African-American men asked for these jobs, wanted to do this work without being paid, wanted to run errands outside the prison, wanted to carry heavy fishing or hunting equipment through the wilderness. But it's important to remember, if you're studying, you know, 19th century New York periodicals, they were all partisan, right? So it didn't take long to figure out that one of the newspapers I was looking at was a Democratic Party paper. And so, of course, they're going to say, oh, well, you know, they volunteered. You know, they don't mind doing this work. But then, you know, you sort of realize, well, it's only the African-American incarcerated people who are doing this work. And then you start to wonder, well, you think they really volunteered? I mean, do you really think that they were like raising their hands and saying, please pick me? And that the officers having a choice among Irish, indigenous people who were incarcerated there, French Canadians, I mean, a wide variety of folks incarcerated, only picked them at random. It's really hard to believe. This is one of those areas in history where there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of room for debate, but knowing the politics of that time, and that this was only less than 30 years after the end of slavery in New York. And also, of course, knowing that this Democratic Party was heavily implicated in the continuation and expansion of slavery, it's hard to imagine that these 3 men did this voluntarily. And my guess is, and future research may bear this out, that this was not an isolated incident.
So this is something that's sort of an invitation for further historical inquiry. In the late 19th century, I think perhaps a better known story about the Adirondacks is sort of post-Civil War. Things are changing fast up there in the North Country. More and more visitors, I think mostly wealthy at this time, but more and more interest, more extractive industries as well. How does the prison fit into that story of sort of what we think of as the North Country suddenly becoming getting everybody's attention?
So after the Civil War, as you point out, there is improved infrastructure. There are improved roads and rail connections and more communities. And there are more rich people. So, and there are more sort of overcrowded, unkempt cities that rich people want to run away from in the summer. And so the Adirondacks is still relatively undeveloped, and I hate to use the word pristine, but parts of it are, right, sort of untouched. And the Adirondacks is becoming popular with wealthy folks from New York City, Albany, Boston, smaller cities in the Northeast. And many of them are coming up. At first, they're staying in hotels that are being built. A large one in this community called Blue Mountain Lake was the first hotel in the world to have electricity in every room, electric light. Even though most of the people living nearby didn't have electricity, the hotel was fully electrified. And some folks were coming up and staying in rustic log cabins and getting, roughing it, getting a full wilderness experience. The wealthiest, though, eventually built summer homes in the area, bought up large pieces of land and built these large homes that they called camps, that they'd come and stay in for weeks or months at a time. And so while all of this is happening, the prison at Dannemora is growing, right? Its population is growing. A town has been built around the prison. People have built homes. There are streets and small businesses around the facility. And that rotting wood wall that you mentioned before is eventually replaced with a stone wall, which still exists today, which you can't miss if you travel through there. And at that same time, the logging industry and mining industries in the area are taking off. The US population is growing, especially there's this new wave of immigration in the late 19th century. There's increased demand for wood, for construction materials, and also for fuel, and that's nationwide. And so the logging industry moves into the Adirondacks. They know they have sort of insatiable demand for their product. The steel industry as well, the growth of the railroads has also insatiable demand for iron ore, which can be mined in the Adirondacks. So these two large industries growing simultaneously, but also another industry which folks who maybe know about the Adirondacks might not know about is institutional healthcare. Folks with tuberculosis, which was one of the #1 killers in the US at the time, started traveling to the Adirondacks to take what they referred to as the cure, right? To go to Saranac Lake, to go to other areas deep in the forest, to breathe the fresh mountain air, to be cured of this dread disease. So the area is being used for a variety of new purposes, but in a way that, I guess, on a scale that it hadn't been before. Logging, mining, institutional healthcare, tourism, and then this prison, right? It's like an outlier. It's just there. And the region's being overused. By the 1870s, there are fears for the Hudson River watershed. The Hudson River has its source in the Adirondacks at Lake Tier of the Clouds, which in the Hudson River was still a major artery for transportation, both people and consumer goods, connected to the Erie Canal, obviously. And the overlogging of the region was threatening those water courses, right? The soil erosion that was being caused as a result of deforestation was making flooding worse in the Adirondacks, and a lot of the debris created by excessive logging was finding its way into the Hudson River, which posed threats to public health, posed threats to the state economy. But also deforestation and sort of rapid industrialization in the area were threatening the aesthetic of the Adirondacks that drove many visitors to the region in the first place. And nobody wanted to go on vacation next to an iron mine or next to a logging camp, right? I mean, nobody came to see a cutover forest or to watch people, blowing up a hillside while they're on vacation. So, a group of the wealthy visitors, wealthy landowners began pressuring state lawmakers to enact conservation measures in the region, not to end economic activity in the region, but to restrict it in a way that would allow logging and mining and healthcare to continue, but to continue in a way that also allowed them to enjoy their vacations in what they believed was a pristine and untrammeled environment. And so in 1885, the state established the Forest Preserve, right, restricted the sale of properties in the Adirondacks and in the Catskills as well, that could not be sold to logging companies, could not be sold to individuals. The trees and plants on those properties could not be touched. And the idea was that the state over time would increase the size of its forest preserve by buying up either lands that had not been cut yet, or by buying cutover lands and then replanting them and restoring them to their former state. Of course, the problem was the state didn't have enough money to buy up all the land in the Adirondacks that it wanted to add to the forest preserve. And there were landowners in the Adirondacks who didn't want to sell, right? Logging companies, mining companies needed those trees either for sale or for use in construction and fuel. So the forest preserve solves part of the problem of overdevelopment, but not all of it. So then the state goes back to the drawing board and they're like, okay, how can we really solve this problem? So they come up with the idea of creating a state park in the Adirondacks. But again, the problem is if they're going to create a state park, there's a couple problems. One, there's a lot of people living in the Adirondacks now. I mean, not hundreds of thousands, but there are easily thousands living there, working there, visiting there every year. There's a variety of economic activities being performed there. There's logging, there's mining, there are tuberculosis sanitaria. There are people who've built new homes just to cure from tuberculosis. There's a prison. There are people's private homes, their second homes. And then there are the permanent residents who also have their homes and their properties in the region. So if you're going to create a park, how do you create a park with all these people living in it, living inside it? How do you create a park with all of this economic activity going on? And so the Adirondack Park, when it was created in 1892, was really more aspirational. So this blue line is drawn around the Adirondacks, the region that they want to protect from development. And in fact, my little cup here, you can see the shape of the Adirondack Park. I used this on purpose today. And the goal over time was to eventually fill in this whole area with forest preserve, right? So to create one large state park, which of course would have meant that all that economic activity would have to cease. All the people living there would have to leave. But it would also require the state to have enough money to purchase all that property and also have willing sellers, which neither of which they ever had. So to this day, the Adirondack Park remains a patchwork of privately owned properties and state-owned properties, some of which are used for incarceration, as we've talked about, some of which are used for outdoor recreation, camping, and other activities, and many of which are privately owned. And so it's an unusual park in that sense. It's not like Central Park or Yosemite. You see those big signs, and they do look like this when you travel into the Adirondack Park. They're shaped like this. This is the shape of the park. And people not familiar with the area might think, oh, we're going to this really big park. This is wonderful. And then they see logging activity, or they might see someone's house. So it was aspirational more than anything else. But 2 years later, and this is really, I think, important for even today, this is still an ongoing debate. The state constitution is amended in 1894 with a provision called Forever Wild. At least that's what it's sort of colloquially known as. And this was designed to protect the forest preserve, because even after the creation of the Adirondack Park, again, with this goal of one day creating this giant forest preserve where people would go for hiking and camping and recreation, there was still a lot of logging going on in the Adirondacks. There was still a lot of mining going on. There was still problems with forest fires and flooding. And there was fear that the forest preserve itself, if someday in the future, an administration took power in Albany that was hostile to environmental protection, the forest preserve could be overturned, right? The land might be sold to developers. It might be sold to logging companies or mining companies, and the whole region could be destroyed. And so to prevent that land from being sold in the future and potentially ruined, the state constitution is amended in 1894 and basically says that all of the trees, all of the plant life in the forest preserve cannot be touched, cannot be cut, cannot be used, has to be left in its sort of current state. And I mentioned earlier that this remains a point of contention in the region, even today, with the construction of snowmobile trails. There was actually a case this year at the State Court of Appeals about Forever Wild. So, I mean, it's an old provision, 127 years old now, but still the subject of debate. Doubling back to the prison, though, then I'll shut up. The prison in Dannemora was exempted from all of the state's environmental rules, right? So the Clinton State Prison, when you go through there, it's inside the Adirondack Park, but it's like a little island in the Adirondack Park where all the state's environmental regulations do not apply, right? They can basically do whatever they want on the properties that they control. And so you sort of see, when that decision is made in the late 19th century, you sort of see some folks thinking, prisons probably don't belong inside a place called a park, right? So we don't confuse people, maybe we better just exempt the prison, pretend it's not even inside the park, even though it is. We'll just exempt them from the rules, and then we'll sort of be able to tell people, well, it's legally inside the park. On the map, it's there, but it's really not, right? It's like Swaziland or Lesotho, right? It's sort of in there. It sort of does its own thing, and it's separate from the park. So, yeah, that's sort of my history of conservation in the late 19th century and sort of how Dannemora fits into that.
Well, I mean, I think it's really important because all of this, right? You've got now this pattern of how the state deals with overcrowding and this interest in the use of the North Country for various means, but also by the time they have this 1894 Constitution, they write into it, as you say, Forever Wild, and that's going to complicate things. maybe not for Clinton, but maybe for some of the others, because now all of this sets the stage for leaping ahead in time pretty significantly. And in the basically late 20th century, so we're talking, I mean, the rest of your book is really 1960s, but especially 70s, 80s, 90s to the present. And you layer on top of that new attitudes about law and order, new laws within New York State, and simultaneously, well, I'll actually just quote from you very briefly, because you suggest that, okay, we've got all this 19th century background, and then you say that the simultaneous emergence of mass incarceration and environmentalism, you acknowledge this was purely coincidental, but the growth of prisons in the Adirondack Park made these seemingly disparate phenomena historically inseparable. The 19th century background that we have and these two more recent developments, everything is in place for the rest of your story. So talk about how all of this prepared us for these series of case studies that we're going to dive into now.
Okay, so one of the big problems of the late 20th century in New York was deindustrialization. It's really hard to talk about incarceration in New York during that time without talking about the economic pressures that were placed on the state's urban centers, really, by beginning in the 1960s and then really accelerating in the 1970s with the closure of the major sources of jobs, factories and plants in suburban areas, but also inside cities. And in many cases, the closure of these, historical sources of employment and middle class status hurt people of color the most, right? Hurt people who were already at a disadvantage more than anyone else. So when you have this sort of wave of plant closures, rising unemployment, rising demand placed on social service agencies and social welfare supports in the state in the 1960s and into the early 1970s, you also see an increase in unlawful activity. So it's sort of the early 19th century being played out again in the late part of the 20th century. You see folks who were sort of already at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, they're being squeezed more than ever. And there's really nobody can see the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of deindustrialization and really how bad this might get. But what everyone seems to be able to see is the increasing unlawful activity, right? And everyone seems to be able to see that narcotics seem to be at the center of this problem. And so the state in 1973 updates its existing narcotics statutes. So there had been an anti-narcotics law passed in 1966 called the Narcotics Control Act, signed into law by Nelson Rockefeller. And of course, he's still governor in 1973. He's governor forever. And he, a Republican, with support from Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature, crafts this package of amendments to this 1966 law, which is later passed and then signed by Rockefeller and becomes law, right? These are the Rockefeller drug laws, which mandated 15-year minimum prison sentence for either the possession or sale of very small amounts of controlled narcotics. And these 15-year sentences could be handed down to anyone 16 years of age or older. So the state was effectively laying the groundwork for mass incarceration in 1973. Again, not really addressing the root problem, right? We go back to the 19th century, same movie being played over again here. So not addressing the disparate impacts of deindustrialization on communities of color, not addressing the disparate impacts of deindustrialization on cities versus suburban areas, for example, just squarely focusing on what they believed would help them win the next election with an anxious, white, middle-class, well-to-do electorate, which was going after people of color who were either actually engaged in narcotics activity or who were trapped in police corruption, right, which sent many people to prison. So by 1975, the state has 32 prisons and they are approaching 100% capacity, primarily because of this these Rockefeller drug laws, quote unquote. And once again, the state, just like in 1817, has an overcrowding problem, right? They could have seen it coming, but, you know, I'm sure they did, but it happened, right? The overcrowding came, and the state had to figure out very quickly what to do. This was a major crisis. Not only were the state's prisons overcrowded, but the number of new convicted offenders was increasing by the day, and there was no place to send them. And so the state began by looking in suburban areas near the state's large cities, because the State Department of Correctional Services did have a directive in place that stated that incarcerated people had to be incarcerated near where they lived, right? They believed that family contact was extremely important to rehabilitation. Again, not addressing why people did these things, but saying, well, you should be near your family, and that's good. But people living in the suburbs around New York City especially said, we like these Rockefeller drug laws. We like that all these people are being convicted, but we don't want them incarcerated near our houses, right? So the state has a problem, right? It wants to build prisons following its own directive, but the people in those areas say, hell no, you're not building prisons here. Fortunately, right, fortunately for the state, deindustrialization hit the Adirondacks as well. So by the 1970s, there are shuttered logging camps, there are closed down tuberculosis hospitals, there are closed public schools. There's a sort of a variety of institutional settings that are abandoned in the Adirondacks. And so the state realizes, well, these buildings are just sitting empty. Some of them we own already. The people in the Adirondacks are also suffering from unemployment and poverty. Maybe we could build prisons up there, new ones, and not only solve our overcrowding problem, but also give jobs to the people who live in the Adirondacks full-time, who are struggling to find new employment in a difficult economy. And that's really where this new round of prison building in the region started, was with this very old idea that prisons will solve overcrowding. No, they don't. And they'll help generate sort of economic revitalization, which they're not good at that either. So that's sort of the Dannemora model of 1845 being sort of overlaid on the Adirondacks of 1976, right, when the first new prison opens.
It's really uncanny how familiar the story sounds when you're telling it in the 1970s to what you were telling in the 1830s, 40s, as they're looking northward to begin with. One difference, perhaps, is that there are, as you say, a lot of people in the North Country who've suffered through deindustrialization, and many of them are also clamoring for this investment from the outside. And that sets up an interesting dynamic we can talk about in these case studies, right, between those people who are local who want this, and those who are either local or from the outside, and there's a little bit of each, who say, wait a minute, this is an environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. And that sort of is a new variation on that theme that you've already established. And as we move forward, I think you address it very well in each of your case studies. So maybe it's best to dive into some of those. 1980 is a big year for the Adirondacks, right? Because they're on the global stage once again. They had the Olympics decades earlier, right? But this is their second Olympics. And while we're at it, let's build some prisons up there. So talk about the Olympic prison and what's going on up in that region.
Okay, so the Olympic prison is both a pejorative term and also a real place that you can actually go and drive to, still there now. So when Lake Placid in Essex County was awarded the right to host the 1980 Winter Olympics in 1974, they had no plan on where the athletes would be housed. Now, Lake Placid is only has about 3,000 year-round residents. And so they won the Olympic bid after bidding many times in the 1960s and 70s. They finally won this bid. Actually, win is being generous because the other competitor had already dropped out by the time the International Olympic Committee voted, so they were the only ones left. And they had no place to house roughly 2,000 people. And the International Olympic Committee requires that all athletes and coaches be housed in one location. So they won the Olympic bid, and I think they were just relieved to get that done. And then they realized, oh, right, we have to house these people somewhere for 3 to 4 weeks. And so the Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee, which was made up of mainly local business people and some elected politicians, some clergy too were members of the LPOC. They began looking around for different places where they might house all these people. They looked at the local community college, North Country Community College. They talked about building something brand new, but they couldn't find the land. And of course, there were environmental regulations that would probably slow everything down. And so eventually the Olympic organizers settled on an old tuberculosis hospital in Raybrook. And Raybrook is about 6 miles from Lake Placid, very tiny little hamlet that if you go from Saranac Lake to Lake Placid, you pass through Raybrook. Nice little mountain community, and has this huge 540-acre complex of buildings that from 1904 to 1971 served as a state-run tuberculosis hospital and research facility. And then from 1971 to 1975 served as a state-run narcotics treatment facility for women. So this massive facility was sitting there. It had closed, and Lake Placid's Olympic organizers, they see an opportunity, right? This place is probably big enough to house everyone who's coming for the Olympics. But then they had to worry about what to do with it when the Olympics ended, because Congress was paying for the Olympics. And Congress had put a stipulation in the Olympic funding bill requiring every facility have an after use. They didn't want any white elephants being left behind, right? This had been the problem in Sapporo, Japan in 1972 when the Winter Olympics were held there. And they built 14 brand new facilities, and many of them went unused after the Olympics ended. And Congress said, we'll fund the Olympics, but you're not building any white elephants. So they said, okay, the Lake Placid Olympic organizers said, okay, first we will house Olympic athletes there, then the state can take it over and turn it into a prison. So it was Lake Placid's Olympic organizers who first planted that seed in the public mind of using this facility as a prison. And once that seed was planted, it just started to bloom, right? So in 1976, Lake Placid's Olympic organizers went ahead. They started the process of taking over this facility, turning it into an Olympic village. But the state of New York's prisons were also overcrowded at the same time. And the state owned the facility. So the state also had its eye on this facility. And of course, the Lake Placid Olympic organizers had given them the idea, ooh, this could be a prison, right? So they start thinking about using it as a prison. The Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, also contending with overcrowding. They hear these discussions and they're like, oh, that looks like a pretty good place to build a prison. So you've got three large bureaucracies fighting over this massive sort of pre-made institutional facility. And in August of 1976, the governor of New York, Hugh Carey, the Democrat, simply turns the facility into a prison. He can do it because the state already owns the buildings, owns the property, and he says, this is a minimum security prison. Incarcerated men who were at Clinton and Dannemora, in an area called the Annex, they were taken by bus to Raybrook. They actually helped renovate the buildings to convert them for correctional use. And in September of 1976, the state opened its second prison in the Adirondacks. But the problem was Lake Placid's Olympic organizers and the Bureau of Prisons were sort of left holding the bag, right? They're like, oh, they were really sad. They didn't really know what to do because the Olympics are less than 4 years away. There's really nowhere else to go. The Bureau of Prisons, they liked Raybrook too. They liked those buildings. And so the Republican congressman who represented this district, Robert McEwen, he represented this district from 1965 to 1981. He stepped in. He brought the Bureau of Prisons and the Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee together. He brokered a meeting between these two, and he said, why don't you build an Olympic Village, brand new facility, let Congress pay for it, and then once the Olympics are over, we'll convert it to a medium security prison. So you'll both get what you need. And in November of 1976, that deal was signed. And the plan was, as I just mentioned, to build a new facility in Raybrook directly across the road from the state prison that had just opened on a piece of land that was not developed at the time. Build it first as an Olympic Village, and then convert that facility after the Olympics and turn it over to the Bureau of Prisons as a medium security prison. The model for this facility, this Olympic Village, was the federal prison in Memphis, Tennessee. So if you ever go to the federal prison in Memphis and then you visit the one in Raybrook, the architectural design is almost exactly the same. And this solution, quote unquote, satisfied both parties. So everyone gets a prison, right? The state got a prison, the Olympic organizers got one, and the Bureau of Prisons got one. So Raybrook by 1980 has two prisons, whereas in 1976 it had none.
Parenthetically, was there any comment along the way during the Olympics by anybody like, hey, we're hanging out in a soon-to-be prison? Was anybody sort of put off by that, or did they just sort of were they unaware of all this sort of wrangling?
well known that this facility was being converted to a prison. There was an opposition group that formed. So there was a group called Stop the Olympic Prison that was formed in New York City and had chapters actually in different parts of the state. And in Syracuse and in Albany, there was a small one up in Plattsburgh, and that were very active in trying to stop this facility from becoming a prison. So by the time the Olympics began, the athletes knew. In fact, there were journalists who went and asked the athletes how they felt about this. And in fact, I read this interview with some of the Soviet athletes who just said basically, like, we're just here to compete. We don't care. We don't really want to get involved in your politics. There were some small protests during the Olympics. I mean, very small, that were barely covered by the press. And I think the biggest, I guess, during the Olympics, of course, there were a lot of protests before the Olympics, but during the games themselves, there were many athletes who refused to stay there. And that was part of the story of Lake Placid's Olympics that year, is that many athletes complained that the rooms were too small, that they were housing 4 athletes in a room designed for 2 people. And so many of the athletes, especially the skiers from other countries, stayed in Vermont, which is just across the lake, rented their own hotel space or cabins to stay in, and then just took buses over here for their competitions. So the Olympic Village was actually not full, did not operate at full capacity during the Olympics, because there were many people who were afraid of the easy spread of viruses in those tiny rooms during the games. But yeah, during the Olympics, there definitely was awareness of what was going to happen to this facility. Yeah,
it makes the story even more fascinating to me. And what's interesting too, you mentioned Stop, and you mentioned where Stop had its chapters, and I didn't hear much in your rundown about local opposition, and you do a really nice job of explaining why that often they were ineffective at cultivating local opposition. What were their arguments, and why did people in the region not buy in? Mostly, I mean, some did.
Mm-hmm. So Stop the Olympic Prison, their main arguments against this prison opening had to do with the over-reliance, the increasing over-reliance on incarceration in New York and at the federal level, but also the fact that a disproportionately large number of people of color were being incarcerated for narcotics offenses that in many cases were the result of police corruption, and that in many cases were the result of economic stress brought on by deindustrialization. And so there was a fundamental unfairness about this drive toward mass incarceration that many members of Stop wanted to point out to the public, and wanted this facility converted to something else. It was already being built, so it couldn't be completely prevented. The construction was happening, but they wanted it converted. Really, their ultimate goal was to have it converted to an Olympic training center. And what's interesting though about Stop is that they, in their materials, and they have there's a rich archive of promotional materials and literature that they produced. They claim quite a bit to be against prisons, to be against incarceration, but they also say repeatedly that they just want the prison moved somewhere else. So, it's sort of hard to pin them down at times, like where they stood. I mean, they'd say they're against this over-reliance on incarceration. They're against this over-reliance on prisons, and there's this racial justice aspect to it that they're wanting to bring attention to. But then at the same time, they say, well, we just don't want this prison built here. It's not compatible with the Adirondack Park. The Adirondack Park is for recreation and tourism and leisure, not for prisons. It's going to, drive people to not come and vacation here. It's going to be a blemish on the community's reputation, on the nation's reputation as they host the Olympics in the same year that the Soviet Union was hosting the Olympics. So they have a variety of objections, but none of them really speak to the needs of local people, because the prison was being built directly across the road from the other prison. And it was being built on a piece of land that was not developed. And that land had a place in the community. People used it for recreation. People hiked there, they skied there, they camped, they went fishing. It was actually even used as, part of it was used as a sanitary landfill for the state prison. It wasn't just, an empty piece of land that people had no connection to. And the biggest objection among local people in 1977, when the construction began, was that they were completely left out of the planning. They were completely ignored. They were basically told, this prison's being built, take it or leave it. And when the construction began, they were shocked because they weren't even told when the construction would begin. The construction trucks and the bulldozers and the crews arrived one morning and just started cutting trees down and did not really take heed of the environment of that area, which included the people, right? And so what happens is the sort of irresponsible construction practices which were engaged in by this company, Gilbane Building Company, which was the contractor for the Olympic Organizing Committee. They cut down 75 acres of forest. They excavated over 1 million cubic acres of earth. They had to flatten the terrain to satisfy the Bureau of Prisons. They created these piles of wood chips and dirt. And then these heavy rainstorms came through and washed all of this debris into local wetlands that surrounded the prison site and a stream nearby, Ray Brook, actually, where the name comes from. And this pollution that was caused by the construction company plus the weather killed large numbers of organisms that lived in that ecosystem, created a huge sandbar inside the wetlands and inside this brook that destroyed the food source for many of the aquatic creatures that live in the area, and also spoiled the local drinking water supply. As folks reported, cloudy and sort of dirty colored water coming out of their showers and sinks. So the local people organized and petitioned to have the Bureau of Prisons clean this up. But the Bureau of Prisons said, well, it's not our responsibility. Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee, they're using the buildings first. So talk to them. And then the Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee said, well, it's also not our responsibility because the Department of Justice, it's coming out of their budget. That's where the money's coming from. So talk to them. Nobody wanted to be responsible for this, ecological disaster. And local people who were looking to stop for help found no help, right? Stop's concerns lay elsewhere. And so there's this disconnect over environmental protection between the biggest group of prison opponents, Stop, and the people who actually were affected by this disaster, who were living right next to this prison site. So even though Stop sort of was the loudest, represented the loudest group of opponents of the Olympic prison, they didn't necessarily represent the interests of people who lived in the area and who had a different set of concerns about its construction.
Now, as all of that's going on, you note a surprising story across the street because it's a story of at least temporary collaboration at Camp Adirondack. You say that I'm quoting here, incarcerated men, prison staff, and residents forged partnerships that fortified the institution's place in the community. A culture of outreach and exchange took root, characterized by activities emphasizing social welfare, health, and education. How did people make this work, at least for a little while? It seems like there's something different than the sort of dark, inhumane story of mass incarceration going on. What was that like, and how were they able to make it at least temporarily flourish?
So from 1976 to 1981, the state prison, Camp Adirondack, operated as a minimum security camp, which meant that many of the individuals incarcerated there spent their days working outside the prison. In fact, there was no fence around the prison at that time. These were men who had good behavior records at their previous institutions, who had not been convicted of violent offenses, and who were within 2 years of being released. And so they had to meet specific criteria to be there. And so the prevailing theories, I guess, at the time in the late 70s and early 80s were less Auburn-esque than the ones we talked about earlier. So there was a sense that a more humane approach to incarcerated people would yield better results for everyone involved. So because this was a minimum security camp, incarcerated people went out into the community and performed a variety of jobs for the community, for Raybrook and for surrounding communities, conservation work of various kinds, park construction, ski trail construction, hiking trails. But the community was also invited to participate in the life of the prison. So there was an annual open house event held at the prison. Hard to imagine. I mean, they would build like carnival rides for children, and they would have guided tours. Incarcerated people were the tour guides. Local people could go through and see what the prison looked like. Incarcerated people could often received awards from local organizations for the work that they did. They would be invited to dinners, gala dinners held, and they'd be honored for the work that they had completed. And incarcerated people could take college classes at local colleges, at Paul Smith's, at North Country Community College, where the professors would either come to the prison and teach their courses there, or the incarcerated people could go to the colleges themselves and take the courses. There were events held at the prisons. Various social organizations in the area would hold events at the prisons and invite incarcerated people to be part of those events. And one of the biggest programs that went on for many years in local prisons, but started at Camp Adirondack, involved incarcerated people taking old children's toys and sort of fixing them up and refurbishing them, and then giving them to a local charity organization that would provide those to poor children at Christmas time. So there definitely was, during that period when the prison was minimum security camp, there definitely was this really sort of unusual period of collaboration and closeness between the community and the prison. That doesn't mean there weren't problems, but it definitely looked and felt much different than what had gone on at Dannemora in the past.
And 1981 switched to medium security, and it's over, right? I mean, it's pretty. Yeah. Okay, so then in Gabriel's, which is your next example, we see some of these same dynamics, right, of sort of outsider or elite opposition to bringing in a prison. And then we have people locally who maybe are clamoring for the economic boost, or who are, you have this quote, you say, ordinary men and women proudly defended the North Country's long history with incarceration. And so you have that continued disconnect. Talk about the Gabriel story a little bit and how it sort of compares or contrasts to Raybrook, because one thing I thought was interesting there was how the opponents tried to play the race card and how that seems to have fallen flat. And I thought that was a fascinating point, but broadly speak about this story.
Okay. So Gabriel's is a very, very small hamlet in Franklin County inside the Adirondack Park, named for a former bishop of the local diocese of Ogdensburg, and also began really as a settlement for railroad workers who were cutting the railroad line through the forest to St. Lawrence County in the late 19th century. Eventually, the property we're talking about was purchased by a local religious order and turned into a tuberculosis sanitarium in 1894. And that facility operated until 1963 when it closed. And Paul Smith's College, which is just down the road from Gabriel's, purchased the property and used it as dorm space and also classroom space from 1963 until it decided to sell the property in the late 1970s. So again, the state, after its prison opens in Raybrook in 1976, still has a housing problem, right? Still has this crunch of new convicted offenders coming into the state prison system and nowhere to put them. And they also still have suburban residents resistant to prisons being built in their backyards. And they also still have surplus properties in the Adirondacks that seem to be tailor-made for prison construction. So Gabriel's has this large 225-acre property. It's owned by Paul Smith's College, a private entity, so the state can't simply convert it to a prison like it did in Gabriel's, but it hopes that, again, if it sort of engages in the same kind of salesmanship that they did with Raybrook and with Dannemora for that matter, that building a prison in Gabriel's will be easy, right? If they just say, well, you know, we're going to bring a lot of jobs to your community needs jobs, economic impact, free prison labor, nobody will complain. But there were Gabriel's in the area around Upper St. Regis Lake, which is right near Gabriel's, had been a very popular destination for very wealthy tourists since the late 19th century. I mean, right near there is what was called the Summer White House, right? For President Calvin Coolidge, Camp Pine Knot, which is one of those great camps I mentioned earlier, is right down the road from this facility. So this was an area that had long been implicated in the Adirondacks tradition of elite tourism. And once word began to spread in the summer of 1981 that the state was planning to purchase these buildings and turn them into a prison, that population showed its face. And that was very different from what had happened in Raybrook, where the local population really didn't have a say in whether a prison would open. It was just opened. And then a new one was built across the road, and they were sort of acting, responding in a more reactive way. Now the plan is being handed to them. The state is saying, we're going to build this prison. We'd like to purchase this property. And the community actually has a chance to potentially stop that from happening, right? The state's not coming in and just ramming it through. So this organization forms called Citizens Against More Prisons in the Adirondacks in the summer of 1981. It's mainly very well-to-do local homeowners. Some of them are seasonal homeowners, some live there permanently. But it's mainly, like you suggested, Rob, mainly people that locals would refer to as outsiders, even though many of them have lived there longer than some of the permanent residents, but that's another story. And they organize and they begin collecting signatures on a petition. A hearing is held at Paul Smith's College in the summer to solicit people's input, and also for the state to have a chance to let people know what its plans are. And the community, which is mainly composed of these sort of well-to-do homeowners, is uniformly opposed to this prison. There are people who are in favor of it, which I'll come back to, but the loudest and most persistent voices are from opponents. And as you mentioned, in many cases, the arguments that are being made against the prison are environmental, right? There are concerns about a heavy concentration of people in this one location, the potential impacts on water supplies and solid waste removal and sewage and those sort of practical environmental questions. But there are also questions about local loon populations and osprey populations, which are endangered as this prison is being considered for construction in an area that has a lot of lakes and wetlands. And the other part of their argument, though, which is sort of the more insidious and sort of disturbing part, is the racial argument that's made against this prison. Because even by 1981, the vast majority of New York's incarcerated population came from communities of color. And the Adirondacks during that time, I'd say 99% white. I looked at the census records as part of my research for many of these communities. And in some cases in the 1960, 70, 80, 90 census, you might see one person of color in a community, sometimes none. So the folks who are going to be opposing the prison are going to do so, they're going to oppose it on environmental grounds, but the environmental arguments are going to be connected to their desire for racial exclusivity in the community. So they're going to send letters to the Adirondack Park Agency, over 100 letters that are sent privately to different leaders of the Adirondack Park Agency, claiming, again, this is a park. This park was established for people like us to come here and go on vacation, to go canoeing, to go camping, to go hiking, to go skiing. It wasn't built to host prisons. It wasn't built as a site of incarceration. Read the Forest Preserve Act, read the Adirondack Park Act, read the state constitution. It doesn't say anything about prisons. And so there's sort of this, in many of the letters, is sort of this subtle racial argument, like this place we're in, this Adirondack Park, it's for people like us, not people like them. But then some of the opponents were quite direct in their use of racist epithets to describe the people who would be incarcerated at this potential prison. Now, what's interesting is that when the defenders of the prison, and there was a considerable number, I would say they were outnumbered in Gabriel's, but there was a sizable number of folks who were in favor of this project. Many of them said, you know what, we've had prisons here since 1845. Many of our family members and friends have worked in Dannemora. Some now work in Raybrook. The Adirondacks, they would say, is a good place to build prisons. Some would say that prisons or cities actually create the problems that cause people to go to prison. So what better place to incarcerate someone than in the Adirondacks? I mean, that was an argument made back in the 1840s too. And so they sort of countered that racist argument by saying, we're doing a service for these convicted offenders by building this prison, bringing them here, right? Only good things can come from incarcerating these people in this community. And of course, you know, you have to sort of look at that. I don't want to be too cynical, but you sort of do have to look at that and say, okay, well, you know, maybe they just really wanted the jobs, right? And they're sort of trying to say lots of nice things to impress their opponents, or maybe to even impress themselves. But it is interesting because this is a primarily white area. It's primarily white, Irish and French Catholic region, very isolated, very provincial in some ways, I guess you could say. And to have the people who favored the prison sort of speaking out on behalf of incarcerated people and sort of trying to counter these racist arguments was an interesting discovery during the research.
And it's interesting because they made a lot of promises about the economic benefits of a prison. And what was the actual impact? Who won and who lost as a result? Economically, I should say.
Sure. Well, the prison opened in 1982 after over a year of delays that were caused by this group, Citizens Against More Prisons in the Adirondacks, who forced the Adirondack Park Agency to hold hearings, filed lawsuits. They delayed the project as long as they could, but the prison did open in August of 1982. And in terms of economic impact, Gabriel's, and I don't, you know, people who see this video, if you live in Gabriel's or if you're from there, this is not meant as an offense. It's a blip on the map. Raybrook is too. I mean, you could take a small nap while you're driving in your car and miss Raybrook completely. The same is true of Gabriel's. They're lovely little communities, but they are very small. So the people who got jobs at Gabriel's, in many cases, didn't live in the town. They commuted from somewhere else. So the community itself, and I make this point in the book, didn't really change that much. All the people who threatened to sell their properties and move stayed. I found no evidence that anybody left who had said that they would leave if the prison opened. So whatever economic impact there was from opening this prison was negligible in Gabriel's itself, but could be felt in people's individual communities and homes wherever they lived. Now, economic impact, though, I think there's another layer of this that we have to think about. When CAMPA, this group that opposed the prison, was fighting with the Adirondack Park Agency, which was firmly, well, they weren't fighting with the Adirondack Park Agency, they were fighting with the Department of Correctional Services over whether this prison was going to be built. The Department of Correctional Services did, I'd say, the best that it could to accommodate the folks who opposed the prison. They were going to buy this property and build this prison. And, you know, no matter what the opponents said, the state was intending to do this. But the state did make concessions to this group. One was that a large section of the property being purchased would actually not be used for the prison, that property would be purchased by the state and then incorporated into the forest reserve and never logged and never mined and never developed. And of course, the people who opposed the prison said, well, that's nice, but that's not what we're asking for, right? And then the state said, okay, well, we're going to build the prison, but we'll give you all of this free prison labor, right? Maybe that'll make you happy. This is going to be minimum security, so the folks there will be able to go outside. They'll be able to do all kinds of jobs in the community and save you, the taxpayers, money. And they didn't really like that either, right? Because they just didn't want the prison built. They didn't care about what the state was offering them. But what's interesting is that over time, that prison labor program, which is operated by the Department of Environmental Conservation and Department of Correctional Services, made a very big impact in that community. because the work that those men did during the time that that prison was opened, again, just like I mentioned with Raybrook, campsite construction, hiking trails, small local parks, storm cleanup, working on scout camps and soil conservation, flood control, a variety of public works and conservation projects. That made an impact on people in the community. So these people who, had been so vociferously opposed to this prison, over time they kind of softened up. And so by the time the prison closed, or they were planning to close it in 2008, 2009, the community rallied in defense of the prison because the prison provided an economic impact to taxpayers living in that community that was hard to calculate, right? It wasn't like, oh, the new dry cleaner opened, or oh, the new cafe opened. But no, all of this work, which would have cost lots of money if free, people who aren't in prison were doing the work, was done by people making $1 a day, right? And not being paid benefits. So once the reality hit that the prison was going to close, then the people who opposed the prison suddenly realized, oh, we really actually need this place because we get all of this free labor and save all this money from the prison being here.
It was a really interesting point that you made in the book that those who were in favor of bringing the prison because of the anticipated economic benefits of employment really got very little of that, but those who were opposed because they weren't that interested, or in most cases they didn't need that particular, they actually accrued a lot of benefits over time, and it's an irony here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, places that were in desperate need of economic boosts are your other case studies, and Lion Mountain seems to be almost a too perfect example of post-industrial North Country. Briefly talk about sort of this decline of this mining community and what life is like in this incredibly, almost desolate place when the move for a potential prison opens up in this period.
Okay. So Lion Mountain is about 10 miles west of Dannemora. So it's in that same iron mining district of Clinton County that the state natural history surveyors had visited way back in the 1830s and early 1840s. That property, right where Lion Mountain is located, was owned by a succession of corporate interests from really, I'd say really from the late 1790s until the last mine closed in 1967. So folks listening to this conversation would, historians at least, would probably recognize the name of Republic Steel, which was one of the little steel companies that was actually one of the big players in the steel industry in the US in the 20th century. And Republic Steel purchased the property in 1939 and operated it until 1967. And so the area, not just the mines, but about 40,000 acres of land around Lion Mountain was all owned by Republic Steel. I had relatives who worked there in the past. I had an uncle who had the same name as me who was killed in one of those mines in 1963. So my family history is actually tied up with the mines there, and also mines down in Essex County as well. So it's thoroughly a mining community, operated as a company town. People who worked for Republic Steel, just like people who had worked for the Chateauguay Ore and Iron Company, which was the company that owned these mines in the past, their homes were owned by the company. The school was operated by the company, the healthcare facility, the local park. The company provided all of these benefits typical of an American company town of the early to mid 20th century, in exchange for which they expected the backbreaking and difficult labor of a mainly immigrant labor force that traveled to this region for these jobs. And so the mines were closed in 1967. This was at a time, this is sort of at the beginning of deindustrialization. There were increasing imports of foreign steel into the United States that was cutting into American manufacturers' profits. What's interesting, though, is that Republic had just invested several $1 million in upgrading its facilities in Lime Mountain and then just walked away from them. So July 1st, 1967, the mines are shut down. Many folks thrown out of work. My grandfather actually worked for Republic Steel at that time. And I mean, he had a variety of different jobs, but at that time he was working for Republic Steel. He was 49 years old, and he moved to Buffalo at that time to continue working for them at one of their steel mills out there. So the town is left without the industry that gave it purpose, that really created it. And there's this sort of existential dread in this town in 1967. What are we going to do? And there are a variety of redevelopment ideas that the town board proposed, but each of them would have involved further degradation of the local environment. And what was interesting is that once the mines closed in Lime Mountain, only once the mines were closed did people really appreciate the destruction that these mines had caused for nearly 2 centuries of operation, the massive deforestation, the blasting away of mountainsides and hillsides, the holes in the ground, the channels that had been dug that were left behind, the mining equipment that's still rusting there today. Still, it's just this huge brownfield that's just been left there. These huge piles of ore tailings, the pollution of the local drinking water supply, the dilapidated roads and sidewalks and public parks and private homes. The place was a wreck. And only once the economic activity ended did people sort of step back and realize, wow, like Republic Steel and the other companies really destroyed this place. And we're not going to accept another Republic Steel. We're not going to accept another dirty, polluting developer to come in here. And so what's interesting is that this region historically has been conservative Republican, right? I mean, from 1852 to 2008, this region was represented by Republicans in Congress. And the brief period where we had a Democrat, and then, we have another Republican. And so this is a historically conservative region. This is at a period, the early 1970s, the environmental movement is being born, as you mentioned before, but it's also a period when environmental regulations new environmental regulations are being promulgated. And the local population that you might expect would be all in favor of any kind of industry stands uniformly opposed to the town board bringing in any developer, any new source of jobs that could further harm their environment. So it's only after the prisons in Raybrook open and the prison in Gabriel's is being proposed that the town board realizes, well, maybe we could have a prison, right? And so in 1981, during one of their monthly board meetings, it's just a brief mention in the board meeting minutes. One of the members of the town board suggests, let's contact the Department of Correctional Services. We have an empty public school that's not being used. Maybe they could turn that into a prison. And it took a couple years for this proposal to sort of work its way up to the higher echelons of the state government. But in 1983, the local Republican state senator, Ronald Stafford, who was a very powerful figure in the state Senate when they had a Republican majority, and also just a very powerful figure locally for a very long period of time. He was an instrumental figure in getting the state to decide to build a prison in Lion Mountain. But as I relate in the book, it's kind of funny. It's the local Catholic priest in Lion Mountain during one of his homilies, where he sort of went off script for a minute, who told the congregation that a prison would be opening right next door because the church is right next to the school. And so then, Ronald Stafford was preempted by this priest who I actually knew. And he had to come out the next day and say, yes, it's true, we're going to open a prison there. The local community, though, they reacted in a way that was unusual for that time. Like, people in Raybrook had been vehemently opposed because of environmental reasons. In Gabriel's, there was this sort of racist argument with environmental overtones that had been put forward. In Lion Mountain, it was just kind of like a shrug of the shoulders. Many folks were like, many of us already work in Clinton. It's only 10 miles away. Many of us know the prison system already. It's not going to be environmentally damaging in the way that some of these other proposals that the town board had put forward might have been. So many folks in Lion Mountain, they're not crazy about the idea of a prison coming in, but they're also not opposed to it either because they sort of feel like they know the system already. So the state, begins rapidly opening a prison in Lion Mountain in 1983 and finishes that process in 1984.
It's that story really jumped out at me for a few reasons, because it almost feels like a community that's kind of, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing, but it almost feels like everything else they've been through, they're just sort of numb, and it's like, well, just don't make things worse and whatever. And to me, it really struck me that there might not be a more perfect metaphor for the almost hopelessness of post-industrial sort of Rust Belt America than the idea of repurposing a defunct public school and turning it into a prison. I mean, there's something just profoundly sad about that, and it's not just a metaphor. I mean, this is what's really going on here. And does this tell us anything sort of broadly about deindustrializing North Country and sort of their views of any future, especially as we think about the other post-industrial recently, where the log in Tupper Lake, where the logging is gone, and well, what do we do to deal with this? Does this story in Lion Mountain tell us anything more about sort of the sadness that's enveloped these places?
I think that, well, there was a precedent, I guess, in terms of converting the school into a prison. That had actually already happened. There's a small town called Altona, which is in Clinton County, which is just outside the boundaries of the Adirondack Park, so not subject to the types of environmental regulation that Lion Mountain was. And the state in April of 1983 had purchased their former school, and because there were no environmental regulations to follow, had already rapidly turned it into a medium security prison, which still operates today. So there was precedent for turning a school into a prison. But I definitely hear your point and hear what you're saying. Lion Mountain in 1983 let's go backwards just a little bit. In the 1870s, the population was around 3,000. By 1983, the population was around 800. And about half of those people were retired. And the other half many of them were actually working at Clinton or working elsewhere. So the community itself, I'd say, was dying. It existed, but its purpose for existence had disappeared. And the prison, there's no way the prison was going to sort of replace mining, which had had such a pervasive impact on people's lives and on the environment. And I definitely agree. Like the fact that a school, a place of joy and a place of acquiring new knowledge and growing and discovering new possibilities and new worlds, that would be turned into a prison, and that nobody in state government that I ran across questioned this, right? That nobody said, this just looks terrible that we're doing this. Does, I think, speak to the sadness of that era, that the state was rapidly locking up tens of thousands of people of color and simply needed space to put them in. And whatever space they could find, they used. I mean, I'll just relate a small anecdote to illustrate this. It doesn't have to do with schools, but I think it speaks to the point that you raised. At one point in the early 1980s, when the state was really struggling to find space to incarcerate people, I ran across a case of one of the prisons in what we up here in the North Country call downstate New York. I found a case where an incarcerated person had been sent to one of the state prisons, I think south of Albany, and there was so little space. The hallways had been taken up with cots, the gymnasium, the nurses' station. I mean, incarcerated people were everywhere. There was one man, there simply was no space for him, so he was handcuffed to the chain link fence surrounding the prison. So a state that would turn a school into a prison isn't terribly surprising when you hear that they would handcuff someone to a fence outside due to lack of space.
And well, that reminds me of something I wanted to ask later, but I'll ask it now because I think it's really to that point. And you bring this up again and again. And I'll say, I've said it a couple of times, one of the things that's really wonderful about your analysis here is the sort of sensitivity and humanity of your analysis, especially when a lot of people aren't being sensitive or humane, especially when it regards to the incarcerated themselves. We've had a lot of discussion about people debating the environmental impact, the economic impact, what does this look like? What are these big sort of macro trends? And you point out again and again, very few people are talking about the incarcerated. Very few people are talking about what this means for them. What does that say about this moment in America? And what were some things that jumped out at you as the historian studying this about that problem with this moment?
I think that reflected the racism that's sort of built into the United States. I think that it reflects the backlash to the civil rights movement, which definitely informed passage of the Rockefeller drug laws. I know there's some debate about that among historians, but I would definitely take the side saying that the Rockefeller drug laws were both a reaction to a real problem. I mean, it wasn't invented. There was a narcotics problem. There was a problem of increasing unlawful activity, but there was also a huge amount of white unease with the fact that people of color in a very short period of time had been granted new rights and new freedoms and new mobility that they had not known in the past, and that many white New Yorkers were uncomfortable with this, and that the Rockefeller drug laws were a vehicle for remedying what many white New Yorkers considered to be a problem, which was that, if we had a pie and it was called rights, right? White people got all the slices, right? There aren't enough slices of pie left. And so the fact that people of color were increasingly finding employment in professions where they had historically been excluded, finding homes in areas where they had historically been discriminated against or excluded. This, for many white Americans, was a problem. Of course, I'm talking about this in the past tense. This still goes on, right? So I definitely think that the incarcerated population, when in the minds of many white folks, was the Black population, was the Latino population. That there was very little sort of difference between the two. The boundaries between free and incarcerated blurred. That, I mean, and you see that up here. I mean, growing up, I mean, I can remember people, you know, if you saw someone who was African American outside, like in the supermarket or in the store, I remember hearing people say, I wonder how that person got out of prison. I wonder if they escaped. And I don't think that was unique to this area. I think that you could find those same attitudes across the state. So I think the racism that many people subscribe to, maybe not actively, but they grew up hearing the slurs, they grew up with the stereotypes. I think that once that racism was sort of activated by a politician like Nelson Rockefeller, or even politicians at the national level like Richard Nixon and later Ronald Reagan, I think that, and of course later Donald Trump, I think that it would be, we see how easy it is to sort of activate these sentiments. And then those sentiments, once activated, can actually be converted into extremely destructive behaviors, right? So the destructive behavior we're talking about here is the incarceration. The destructive behavior we just witnessed this year was the attack on the US Capitol. Here in the North Country, what do we see? We see Confederate battle flags. We see a Union Army cemetery in Saranac, right near where I went to high school, where people place Confederate battle flags. We see all kinds of racist imagery and messaging on people's homes, on the backs of their cars. We see pro-prison rallies that have been held when prisons are threatened with closure, where people engage in sort of not so subtle racism. So I'd say, to answer your question, yes, we have to look at the culture of racism, which has been the wheel around which American life has turned since time immemorial.
It's there's so much about this story, which I guess just in its very nature is quite bleak. And I suppose if we disregard some of the history of how we got there, your last case study, if we just jump right to the end, which is what you open with at the beginning of the chapter, it's kind of neat because Tupper Lake starts out looking for a prison and they end up with the Wild Center. And I'm like, well, that's a happy ending. But there's more to that story. So I mentioned it a moment ago, this it's not iron mining in this case, it's logging, but similar sort of, you've got politicians campaigning for local office saying, I'm going to bring a prison here. And so now they're going all in. Tell me their story and why they failed this time.
So Tupper Lake, as you mentioned, historically was one of the large centers of logging in the Adirondacks. It's in southern Franklin County. So it's in an area that's often referred to as the heart of the Adirondacks. A beautiful area. But by the 1970s, much of the logging trade had already ended. The town was boarded up. The sort of main commercial area in the downtown of Tupper Lake was largely abandoned, many closed businesses, many homes for sale, many abandoned homes that were sort of just left to rot. And of course, around Tupper Lake, what had been going on? state prison in 1976, federal prison in 1980, another state prison in 1981. So the people in Tupper Lake, the folks on the town board, the town supervisor, realized this might be our ticket to prosperity, right? And of course, that was a message the state was sending. So it's not like they came up with this idea on their own. The state had been selling this as economic development, just like they did in 1845. They're doing it again in 1981. So beginning in 1981, the village of Tupper Lake, unlike in the other communities that I looked at, actively went to the state and asked for a prison, right? They didn't wait for the state to find them. They put together their own proposals and said, please locate a prison here. So the piece of land that they identified was owned by International Paper, which was one of the big logging concerns in the Adirondacks for a very long time, still has a mill in Ticonderoga, and owns a lot of commercial forest land in the region. And the plan was to purchase a piece of land from International Paper and actually build a prison in the middle of this property. So the prison would be in the middle and it would be surrounded by land owned by International Paper. And there would be a road connecting this prison to the main highway. Very strange plan. So 1981, the first proposal. At first, Tupper Lake is sort of taking baby steps toward being a prison town. They're like, okay, we really, really want to be a logging town again too, but maybe that won't work out. So maybe we try to be both. So they decided, they crafted this proposal, very interesting. They were going to ask the state to build a prison, but also ask the state to build an electrical generating plant that would be fed with wood pellets so that the local logging industry could be revived to create the fuel that would go into this plant. This plant would also provide electricity to the prison and to the local public school, which was just next door. And, you know, all would be right with the world. The state passed on this idea, said, you know, interesting idea, but no, thank you. 5 years later, this man, Dean Lefebvre, this Democrat, runs for town supervisor in 1986. And as you pointed out, Rob, his main campaign plank, I guess, is that I'm going to bring a prison to town, vote for me. And he's elected and he begins planning. 1986, early 1987, start planning crafting this bid package, which the state required, and submitted this bid package to the state, did an economic impact study, studied potential impacts on the environment. But then the local residents, the local homeowners, especially just like in Gabriel's, especially the summer, what sometimes people up here call the summer people, the seasonal homeowners, and some of them, again, who had homes in the area, who had lived here longer than some of the permanent residents, they organized. And they used and deployed many of the arguments that had been put forth by Campa in Gabriel's, not as overt with their racial comments, but you know, you don't have to read between the lines too much to figure out what they were trying to say. They're concerned about the racial demographic of the community changing, concerns about the families of incarcerated people moving to the community and draining local social services funds, assuming that they're on welfare, right? Afraid that there'd be increased vehicular traffic. So, you know, the town would start feeling more like a city than a small town. They're afraid of the spread of HIV/AIDS, which at that time was closely associated with people from the Caribbean, especially Haiti. So there are all these sort of dog whistles being deployed, and they're successful. In 1987, the state says no for a second time. They decide to go somewhere else. But Dean Lefebvre is not giving up. He made a promise. He's going to keep it. 1989, tries again. And then The prison opponents, though, they realized, well, we probably can't use the same argument we used the first time to stop this prison, so we've got to come up with something new. By that time, 1989, the prison opponents realized, you know what, the Adirondack Park Agency and the Department of Correctional Services, they don't really get along very well. Corrections Department doesn't like dealing with them. We'll enlist the Adirondack Park Agency, much like the people in Gabriel's had done. And once there was any whiff of the Adirondack Park Agency being involved, the Department of Corrections said, sorry, Tupper Lake, we're not building a prison there. So that's 1981. We had the first proposal, then another one in 87, 89. 1990, the state tentatively decides to build a prison in Tupper Lake, but says, this is an aspirational prison. We're awarding it to you, but we don't have any money. So we can't build it. But if we ever need to build a prison in the future, you will be first on the list. So 6 years go by, no prison is built. 1996, Tupper Lake decides to try again to get this prison built. The town supervisor, he's still in office. I think he's in his third term now, still promising to build a prison. And that's a story unto itself. I actually talked to some of these old town supervisors. Very interesting insights. And the state decides that they'll finally build a prison. Now it's Ronald Stafford, the former state Republican senator who was the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, who had been in office since 1965. He openly admitted, he said, Joe Bruno, who was the former Senate Majority Leader, he said, Joe Bruno's been a friend of mine since 1965. He mentored me when I first entered the Senate. He gave me the prison. He said, Ron, where do you want your prison? And he said, Franklin County. And Joe said, fine, I'll build it in Franklin County. So August of 1997, the state is going to build this supermax prison, right, which would have been unusual for New York State, a prefabricated prison where incarcerated people would have been inside their cells for 23 hours a day, and limited contact with staff and family and outsiders. And when I say that the state awarded the prison to Franklin County, I'm intentional about that because it's important. The northern half of Franklin County is not inside the Adirondack Park. The southern half is inside the park. So the state hedged its bets in saying Franklin County. They didn't say Tupper Lake, they said Franklin County, but everyone assumed, oh, they're going to build in Tupper Lake. So in 1997, it seemed as if this thing was going to get built. The state had a Republican governor, George Pataki. The district had a very powerful Republican state senator, Ronald Stafford. The town supervisor and town board were fully in favor of this project. It had been their idea. And by 1997, there is a large population of correctional employees in the area that are supportive. So the opponents are sort of back on their heels in 1997. And they don't really know where to turn because in addition to the sort of supports that I just mentioned, the Adirondack Park Agency, which is the sort of like the large zoning board that manages development in the Adirondack Park, was also being run by Republicans at that time who were more pro-development than pro-environment. And so there didn't appear to be any chance that the Adirondack Park Agency would stop this prison from being built because the leadership of the park agency had been appointed by Governor Pataki. Many of them were pro-development, pro-job, pro-economic growth, which of course to them meant scuttling environmental regulations or going around them if possible to make sure this project got done. So what happened was the state, the Department of Correctional Services, and the Adirondack Park Agency miscalculated. They started building the prison before any of the required environmental reviews had been done. And this prompted the intervention of the Sierra Club and other local environmental groups, the Adirondack Council, the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks. All these groups got involved, threatened to sue the Adirondack Park Agency, which, as I point out in my book, many people think the Adirondack Park Agency is this, environmentalist organization in, sheep's clothing. Like it's not a government agency, with career employees and political appointees, but that it always sides with environmentalists. In my book, I think I show that the APA played a very significant role in getting prisons built. And in this case, they were willing to ignore their own regulations to allow the corrections department to start building a prison on land it didn't own. I mean, this was, another part of the problem. So once the Sierra Club and the local environmental groups got involved, this organization, Tupper Lake Concerned Citizens, this opposition group, they reemerged. And then it was the corrections department and the local opponent, the local supporters, who were sort of on the defensive, because now this is becoming a major headache for Governor Pataki. Even though he's pro-development, he's also, I'd say, he considers himself a conservationist. He's not somebody who really is interested in despoiling the local environment. And so at the last moment, after this project had been started, the Department of Environmental Conservation intervenes. Again, this is a piece of property that's not publicly owned, but it's being developed by a public entity. And so the Department of Environmental Conservation has the legal right under the State Environmental Quality Review Act to perform its own review. They go in and they say, you can't build here because there's an aquifer under this property. You will destroy local freshwater supplies. You will pollute the environment. And that's all it takes for Governor Pataki to move the project to Malone, which is in Franklin County, so outside the park, to a community that already had 2 state prisons. And this will be its 3rd. And what's interesting is that the people in Tupper Lake, you feel bad for them in a way, because at the end, they worked for 16 years. They came very close to getting this prison. This aquifer was identified. The people in Tupper Lake then said, well, you know what? We're going to try to find out if there's any problem with the property in Malone. And so they found some different maps. One was from the Department of the Interior. There were some other maps they consulted. And then the local prison supporters, they came back and they said, there's no aquifer there, right? We looked at a different map. It doesn't show an aquifer, but there's actually an aquifer at the site in Malone. So if you actually care about environmental protection, you'll build the prison here, because if you build it there, you'll destroy the environment. You'll damage the water supply. And the state by that point said, there's no way we're building a prison in Tupper Lake. It's over. And the consolation prize, as you began the question, was building a natural history museum, right? Which is very lovely. The Wild Center in Tupper Lake, which opened in 2006, not far from where the prison was actually proposed to be built. So no matter how much Tupper Lake wanted a prison, it just was never going to have one.
It's such a remarkable story, and it is like all of the stories you relay. Takes a lot of unexpected twists and turns, which I enjoy. I enjoy so much in this fine book, the combination of really sort of fascinating, unexpected, unpredictable storytelling with really often troubling but important trenchant analysis. And by the time you get to the end, you argue that this history, by engaging with it, which I've already said, it's unexpected, as we're reading this, and that these themes would all combine. But by the time it's over, I'm like, my goodness, it seems to be the reality for a geographically large portion of New York State. And so you suggest this really helps correct misunderstandings of the Adirondacks and of the region. It overthrows maybe some cliches that some of us romantically hold about Forever Wild. How should this story, or how should we reframe our views of the North Country in light of what you've shown us here? Because I don't think you're trying to say, all right, let's raise the forests. So how should we reframe our understanding of the region?
Well, I think on a few different levels. While I was doing the research, and this was not a point that I raised in the final version of the book, but it definitely came out while I was writing and editing. Lots of folks don't understand what Forever Wild means. Lots of folks don't know what the Forest Preserve is. Even people who live here confuse the Forest Preserve and other state-owned lands. They think Forever Wild applies to all state land. So there's a lot of confusion. I think that's still true today. As I said, even among folks here, about what Forever Wild means, what it applies to, and what the different types of land classification are in the Adirondacks. There's definitely a core of people, environmentalists and scholars, I think, who know very well what these different terms mean. But there's a lot of confusion. I think there are definitely folks, people I know from the city who've never been up here, but who've, read advertising or looked at, tourist guidebooks, who think, the whole region is just a big park, right? There's no one living here. There's nothing going on. You just come up and camp. So the Adirondacks is the site of incarceration. So yes, the Forest Preserve lands are protected by the state constitution, but there's one federal property and several state properties that are sites of incarceration. So that's one misconception that I hope people take away from this book. I hope they abandon that misconception that this area is completely protected by the state constitution and state law, and that's not true. I would say another one that is important for us to remember is that the whole area is a site of incarceration, not just the prisons. Because the prisons, this house I'm in was paid for, $20,000 house that my parents bought in 1977 was paid for with income that came from that prison. So go around, these places are unmarked. Right? This house is not marked as the product of incarceration, but this house that I'm in is the product of incarceration, is the product of that law in 1973, the same year my father started working there. And so there's hundreds, thousands of homes around here that would likely not have been purchased, inhabited, used without that system. There are lots of campsites and hiking trails and ski trails, churches, libraries, schools, where incarcerated people went and worked. I mentioned in the book, Bon Jovi spoke at my high school in 1986 after receiving letters from people imprisoned in Lion Mountain asking him to come and give a talk about narcotics. So there are very few places you can visit in this region that have not been touched by the state and federal prison systems. And it's invisible, though. It's sort of this layer of history that's here, but unless you're here and actually actively thinking about it, it's hard to see it. The last point I would make is that this is a Black landscape, right? We think about, I'll send you with the pictures. There's a monument. I just drove past it the other day. It's near Whiteface Mountain. It's actually two monuments. One was built in 1935 to mark the 50th anniversary of the Forest Preserve. And then right next to it, one that was built in 1985 to celebrate the centennial of the Forest Preserve. And they're really lovely plaques. And I've seen them 1,000 times, but I always have to stop and look at them because they're, really an important part of our local history. But they're misleading because they tell us that this area was built by conservationists, right? That the Forest Preserve was signed by Governor David B. Hill, May of 1885. Okay, lawmakers voted in favor of it. Forest rangers came here and protected the Forest Preserve and performed different work that needed to be done. Okay, when we think about environmental conservation during that period, turn of the 20th century, right, it's tempting to just leave the story there, right? The Forest Preserve was created, the Adirondack Park was created, Forever Wild was created, end of story, right? Who kept this place going, though? Incarcerated people, right? And that's not to say that the people who work in the prisons did no work. My father worked in a hellish environment for 25 years. Lots of people I know work in there now. I have family members who work in prison system now. That's not any kind of insult of them, but we have to acknowledge that this region would not be what it is now without the poorly paid, backbreaking work of incarcerated people of color. It simply would not. Where else would the money have come from in these deindustrialized, poverty-stricken communities to do the jobs that those individuals did and continue to do? So when we think about the Adirondack Park, we have to think of it as a site of incarceration, not just at the prisons, but all around the prisons. And we have to think of it as a Black landscape and a brown landscape, because the hands of Black and brown people built this place and continue to keep it the way that it is, so that visitors and residents can enjoy it.
It's a really profoundly important corrective, and I'm grateful that you're presenting it. And actually, at the very end, and maybe you've answered the question, right? You ponder how this history should then be incorporated into public memory, and how can we start to do that?
I think that, again, I look at, I'll just, some personal info here. In the past year, right, been living here again, and first time living here full time since I was 18, 42 now, really old. And I drive around a lot, to go out and take hikes, take walks, and every time I see one of those historical markers put up by the Pomeroy Foundation or by the state or by, local town governments, I snap pictures of them. And, it's just become a little hobby. I organize them by topic. And there are lots of historical markers about, as I mentioned, conservation, the War of 1812, the American Revolution, even Champ, the sea monster that supposedly lives in Lake Champlain. He has his own monument, right in Plattsburgh. But where are the monuments to the Black men who cut the ski trails for the 1980 Olympics at Whiteface Mountain? Where are the monuments for who were paid $1 a day? Where is the monument for those 3 African-American men who were enslaved after slavery ended in New York and the work they performed? We take for granted the roads we drive on and the parks we visit and the stable riverbanks and the forests that are whose fires are put out. We take all of that for granted. We drive past, we walk past, we hike past, we ski past all of these things. But who made them what they are? Who knows? We don't know, because there's no marker. So if we're going to honor a mythical sea creature, I think we can honor actual people who did work for this area, who made it what it is, who kept it preserved for visitors, kept its institutions in good condition for residents, and kept local people and visitors safe. I think that if we can honor people who've been dead for 200 years, I think we can find space to build markers and memorials to people, many of whom were teenagers, who were caught up in a racist moment in this country's history, moment of racial hysteria, who many of whom caught up in police corruption, who weren't even involved in narcotics, and who ended up working here, hundreds of miles from home, away from their families, for decades. So I think that if we're going to be honest about what this place is and what it means, that part of its history has to be included.
I think you make the point so well, and I think that anybody who reads the book, and I hope everybody will be drawn into this argument, and hopefully, excellent. Hopefully, that maybe we can send a copy to Pomeroy Foundation or something. But I think that I think it's such an important story you tell. It's as we said at the beginning, it might start out counterintuitive, but the storytelling is so rich and the analysis is so compelling that by the end, it's no longer counterintuitive. You're more, at least in my case, sort of like, boy, I wish that I had asked more questions earlier. And so it's a really important new book. Again, it is entitled A Prison in the Woods. The author is Jeff Hall. It's Clarence Jefferson Hall Jr. And the publisher is University of Massachusetts Press. Thank you, Jeff, so very much for coming on Empire State Engagements.
Thank you.